To the book of Haggai. To the book of Haggai. And we are going to take some lessons from him, from his prophecies this afternoon. And I know I've mentioned before, but over the last few months I've been kind of studying the minor prophets. And I was trying to study them a little bit in depth to find out some of the history and things around them and kind of who was around when who was around. And to me, that's kind of interesting, but I'm not going to bog you down with that. But there are a lot of good lessons that I'm seeing from the minor prophets. And so I know a few weeks ago I preached a sermon from the book of Malachi, and we gained some lessons there. But tonight, or this afternoon, I thought we would look at Haggai. The minor prophets, and I know that you are aware of this, are not minor because of their content. They're minor because of the amount of content in them. And that's why they're called the minor prophets. They're not any less important than the major prophets. But the major prophets are just longer in chapters and verses than the minor prophets. But here, as we begin to look at Haggai, is one of the minor prophets. And one of the interesting things that in studying this, I found out that Haggai's name means festive. Haggai's name means festive. But an interesting thing about the time of Haggai, there was not much for the Jews to be festive about, because Haggai's prophecy has come just after the Babylonian captivity. And so actually Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi are the three that are after the exile. So after the Jews came back from the Babylonian captivity, these are the three prophets that were prophesying. And also, one interesting fact, Haggai prophesied, and then Zechariah prophesied with his prophecies 2 months later to the same people. So they were only 2 months apart in their prophecies. But the prophecies are somewhat different. Zechariah, there are a lot of visions in the book of Zechariah. And we'll get around to looking at some of his visions at another time. But so they are, Haggai and Zechariah are contemporary with each other. Now, what has happened here, to give you a little bit of background, the children of Israel have come back from the Babylonian captivity, and they began to rebuild the temple. And they get the foundation laid, and they get an offer of help from the Samaritans. And for some reason, the children of Israel say, no, we don't want your help. You leave us alone, we'll do it by ourselves. Well, this kind of aggravated the Samaritans, so they went then to the Persian king and said, look, if you let these folks build this temple, they're going to give you a lot of heartache. And so we would suggest that you don't let them build the temple. And when the Persian king sent the order down to the children of Israel, you need to stop, guess what they did? They stopped. And for 16 years, nothing happened to the building of the temple. It just sat there with the foundation started. And so you kind of wonder, what does that say about their love for God? And you stop and you think about, what did those around them think? What did the world think? How important was it for them to build this temple? But as you think about that, we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. And it wasn't because the children of Israel didn't know what they were to do. Because in Ezra chapter 1, he tells them to go back and build the temple. And so they were instructed to do that. Now, what is one of the lessons that we can get from that? There is a lesson that we can get from that. Important work requires diligent workers. And workers who are not going to stop at the least little bit of opposition. See, they just stopped. And when we read there in Haggai chapter 1, and this is the excuse that they give. In verse 2 it says, "Thus speaks the Lord of hosts, saying," this people says, now the children of Israel are saying, this is their excuse they're giving, the time has not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built. So they're just saying, well, it's not time. It's not the right time to build the temple, but when would be the right time? And so many times when we think about things that we're trying to do, work that we're trying to do, we think, is the time right? Well, it's always time to do God's work. And that's one of the things that he was telling them here. This is the excuse they're using. Now, they also may have been using the excuse that, well, we don't have enough money to build the temple. We don't have all the resources that we need to build this temple. But you go back and you stop and think about it, but God would supply them. But now look at what happens a little bit later in the chapter. And Haggai tells them verse 3 says, "The word of the Lord came by Haggai the prophet, saying, It is time for you yourselves, or is it time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses, and this temple to lie in ruins?" Now what Haggai is telling them here, all right, you say it's not time to build the temple, but yet you have your houses to go to. You have your paneled houses. You have your nice places to go to and to live, but where is God's house? And it's time to build God's house. So that's what he's telling them here, that they need to build the house of the Lord. And there are results of their actions, or their lack of action. And look at what he says as far as the results of their lack of action. In verse 6 he says, "You have sown much and bring in little. You eat, but do not have enough. You drink, but you are not filled with drink. You clothe yourself, but no one is warm. And he who earns wages to put it in a bag with holes in it." What he's telling them here is because of your lack of interest, because of your lack of following God, everything else you're trying to do is just going to waste. You're planting your crops and they're not producing like they should. You're drinking because you're thirsty, but then your thirst is not quenched. You're taking your money and you're putting it up, and when you go back to get it, it's gone. That's a bag with holes in it. You put on your clothes when it's cold, but you're still cold. You're not warm. And all of that's because of their lack of interest. And he says in verse 7, says, "Consider your ways." Consider your ways. Think about what you're doing. Think about what your priorities are. Think about what God is not helping you to do. And we need to make sure that we have our priorities in line. We need to make sure that we're doing the things that God would have us to do. Does God want us to be happy? Yeah, I believe He does. I believe God wants us to be happy. Does God want to bless us with physical blessing? I believe He does. But at the same time, we have responsibilities to God in order to receive those spiritual blessings. And that's one of the things that he's telling them here. You need to build the temple. And I like verse 8, what he says in verse 8. Because here is the solution. He says, "Consider your ways" in verse 7. But in verse 8 he says, here's the solution. You go up to the mountain and you bring wood and you build the temple. That's simple. Here's what you need to do. You go get the wood, you come back and you get started building the temple. What's he telling them to do? He's telling them to get to work. Get to work in doing what you knew you were supposed to do all this time. Get to work doing what you should have been doing 16 years ago. Since this temple is set with only the foundation in for 16 years. And you think about what that portrays. You know, if you see somewhere, I know there was a foundation in a subdivision across from the high school. That foundation sat there, nothing done to it for years. And I don't know but what it's still not sitting there. Just an old foundation, grass growing up inside it. What do you think happened to that? Did somebody start that and then all of a sudden decide, well, they didn't have enough money, or they decided, well, this is not the right place, or, you know, you don't know. And you wonder what went on in the minds of those around them when they saw the temple being neglected like that. Because you think back about Solomon, the temple that Solomon built, and all the gold and all the fine work and the woodwork and all the things that went in, and the embroidering and all the things that went in the building of Solomon's temple, and how beautiful it was. What that portrayed to those around them. What that portrayed to the world. Because, you know, those that were outside the Israelite nation, when they knew of Solomon's kingdom. And see, and that's one of the things that happened here when the children of Israel, when they went into captivity, that temple was destroyed. And the things that were within that temple were carried back to Babylon. And so that's the key. You know, as you think about it, Jehoiachin, I believe was his name, he was the king when the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar came and took them all captive. And he was the king that was chained up and taken to Babylonia. And you know what? He had been king for a whopping 3 months when they came and took them captive. And he was either 8 years old or 18 years old. In Chronicles it says he's 8. In Kings it says he was 18. And there is some discrepancies in the manuscripts as to what his true age is. But irregardless of that age, he was not, his father was what we call a good king, but he was not. And he lasted 3 months. And then his people ended up in captivity. But you know, you think about the things that they lacked in their life, the things that they didn't do, the things that they wouldn't do, and the blessings that God kept from them. Because it says in verse 10, therefore the heavens above you withhold the dew, and the earth withholds its fruit. For I've called for a drought on the land and the mountains, on the grain and on the new wine and the oil, on whatever the ground brings forth, on men and livestock, and on all the labor of your hands. This is what God is telling them. God is telling them, because of your lack of interest, I am withholding the resources of the earth. Now, God works different today than He did then. But at the same time, God still blesses us when we do good. And there may be times that we may suffer, but yet God still blesses us. And you know, you also wonder about the children of Israel, if they got used to not having a temple. After 16 years, they kind of grew accustomed to not having a temple. And I wonder sometimes if we get accustomed to things in our life that are wrong. Was it wrong for them not to have a temple? God thought it was time to build a temple. Do we get used to things? Do we grow accustomed to things that are wrong because it just happens over and over and over? We get used to seeing it. You know, a lot of times when we're building a house or doing some work for somebody, when we get close to being finished, I'll tell the homeowner, I said, you go through the house and you look and you make me a list of anything that you see that we need to work on. Because after we're there so long, you get used to seeing it. And then you don't see it. And I'm afraid I know that's what happened to the Israelites. And sometimes I'm afraid that's what might happen to us. We get used to seeing things. We get used to saying things. We get used to doing things. And we don't realize that it has creeped in and we're standing there facing sin. And so, like they had got used to a broken temple, sometimes we may get used to a broken temple. And we need to make sure that we don't do that. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16, it says, do you not know that you are the temple of God? Our bodies are where Christ and God dwell. Those of us who are Christians. And He dwells in us and we are His temple. And we need to make sure that we don't get used to sin. And the answer that Haggai gave to the children of Israel to get away from that was to get busy building the temple. Simple answer, simple instructions. You get busy. And the same is true with us today. If we allow our temple to be broken down, what does that say about the trust and what we think about God? What does that tell the people around us? We talked this morning in this morning's sermon about what does it mean, does it matter what the world sees in us? Does it matter what the world thinks of us? And yes, it does. Did it matter here what the world thought of the Israelites? Does it matter to us what the world sees in us? Now, chapter 1 in Haggai deals with their lack of interest in building the temple. Chapter 2 talks about, or there's three things, it talks about more than what we're going to talk about tonight, but there's three things that I want us to look at that chapter 2 talks about. It talks about how to deal with the past, what to do in the present, and what to do for the future. And those are three things that I want us to look at. In verse 3 of chapter 2, the Bible says, who is left among you who saw this temple? Who saw this temple in its former glory? And how do you see it now? In comparison with it, is this not in your eyes as nothing? Now, when they began to rebuild the temple, they did not have the resources that we talked about a while ago to build the same temple that Solomon built with all the gold and all the fine embroidery and all the metalwork and all the things that went into building Solomon's temple. But some of the people here that had been in captivity for 70 years had lived all through the captivity. They were alive and saw Solomon's temple before it was destroyed. And what Haggai is asking them, you have seen Solomon's temple. Now, some of them were born in captivity and had never seen Solomon's temple. So they didn't think anything of it. But these here who had lived through the captivity and came back, they had seen Solomon's temple. And Haggai said, compare the two temples. What are they like? And you read in Ezra chapter 3, and he talks about how that some, when they were seeing this new temple being built, some wept. And some wept out of joy because it was being built, and some wept out of sadness because it wasn't as beautiful as Solomon's temple. And they were weeping because of it. And there in Ezra chapter 3, it said, and you couldn't tell the difference who was weeping for what. But you see, that was in the past. And what Haggai is saying here is learn from the past, remember the past, because the past makes you who you are today, but don't live in the past. Because he talks about the new temple that's being built and the importance that it would have and how it would have more glory than Solomon's temple. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So Haggai is saying, don't live in the past. Learn from it, but don't live in it. But now the present, what do we do with the present? And I hear you go back to chapter 1, verse 8. So the instruction from Haggai was go to the mountain, get the wood, come back, and start building the temple. The instruction for the present is to do the work. Do the work that needs to be done. That's what he told them, and that's what we need to do. We need to do the work that is to be done. In John chapter 9, verse 2, it says, we must work the works of him who sent us while it is day. It's our responsibility as Christians to do the work that God wants us to do here today. But then, at the same time, realize that our work today has an effect on the future. Our work today affects the future. And that's our third point. Hope for the future. Now, in chapter 2, verse 9 of Haggai, he says, the glory of this temple will be greater than the former. The glory of this. You remember we talked about how that on the different robes that the priest wore, and on every day except the Day of Atonement, the priest wore the robe that had all the stones on it and all the fine embroidering and the ephod and all those things. He wore that every other day except on the Day of Atonement. And on the Day of Atonement, when he went into the Holy of Holies, he wore the linen robe. And because every other day he was representing God to the people, on the Day of Atonement, he was representing the people to God. But here, Solomon's temple was representing God. The new temple was also representing God, but he says it's going to be more glory in this one than Solomon's temple was. Well, how can we reconcile that when it's not as beautiful as Solomon's temple was? What do you think about this temple? Who would visit this temple? Jesus would visit this temple personally, would walk into this temple and worship in this temple. And I think, too, we could also take that on to a prophecy about Christ being our high priest and Christ being a better high priest. So that's what makes the glory of this temple better than the one before. And you think about that their work building the temple had the effect years and years later, hundreds of years later. So our work today definitely has an effect on the future, and it gives us hope for the future. As we work here, sometimes it gets difficult we get tired, and we get to thinking, well, I just can't get it done. Well, we're told in Galatians chapter 6, not to grow weary in well-doing. For in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. We will receive the reward if we continue to work. So what do we have to do? Learn from the past, work in the present, and then we have hope for the future. Haggai says again in chapter 1, in verse 5, and also again in verse 7, we've already talked about. He says, consider your ways. You know, I can almost hear Haggai pleading with these folks, please look at your life and consider your ways. Because is that not applicable to us today as well? In 2 Corinthians chapter 13, we're told to examine ourselves to see whether or not we are in the faith. Test yourselves. Do you not know yourselves that Jesus Christ is in you, unless indeed you are disqualified? We need to consider our ways. Consider the way that we live our life. Are we stuck in the past? Are we not working in the present? And do we not have hope for the future? Or are we learning from the past, working today, and have hope for the future? Consider your ways, as Haggai says. Think about your life. If you need to respond to the invitation, whether through baptism or just saying, I need to change my life, I need to do better, or if you just need to have a conversation between you and God, let me encourage you to do that. But if we can assist you in any way, we encourage you to come while we stand and while we sing.